We're going to be looking this week at weather and what you can do about it. We're not completely helpless when we're faced with different weather events, so we'll be looking at the solutions that we can use. So what we've got to look at really is the difference that you get with different weather events. If you get strong wind, if you get frost, if you get heavy rain, what effects does that have on growth? And if you look at this piece of fossil, this is a 100 million year old piece of fossilised wood, and you can see the growth rings in this fossil. This is fossilised tree, and you can very carefully see the variability in the rings, and you see it in modern tree trunks as well, and each of those rings tells a story. It shows what the weather conditions were like that year and whether they were good or bad, whether there was a heavy frost in the spring, whether there was strong wind, whether you've had drought, whether you've had floods, or you've had too much heat, and all of those things will affect how much crop you get and how well your plants will do in your orchard. So there are things that you can do that can mitigate or prevent damage from these extreme weather events that we get. And we're getting increasingly variable weather events. We can choose location carefully, we can have crop diversity, we can have variety diversity, we can look at pruning, plant nutrition, and also the spacing between them. All of these different things we're going to look at in this video. So the first thing we're talking about is location, and the most important thing in the northern hemisphere is that you face into the southwest, that the land isn't flat and it slightly slopes to the southwest. And the most important thing about that is that frost won't sit on that land too long, you won't get frost pockets, you capture heat, and you gradually find that the land warms up much quicker than it would do if you were in a northerly aspect. And as you can see here, we've got land that gradually sort of slopes down to the southwest, and that gives us the advantage, particularly in the early spring when you could get a sudden frost. So another thing that can really help against the weather is hedges. Every metre of porous hedge that you have gives you 10 metres or 10 times the length of protection from the wind, and that's very important, particularly in the spring when the blossom has set. You don't want the fruitlets to fall off or to have any problems. And it's very important with the hedge that you use a mixed hedge, because of course that brings in a lot more biology, and that's another huge advantage later on for pollination. But having the rows north-south and having the trees closer together all helps to prevent the cold building up in the orchard and the wind causing a temperature drop, which stops insects flying and prevents pollination, and of course that has a huge effect on the yield. So as you can see here, our spacing is quite close, and it does help to keep each of the trees protected from the cold. So here's an example where you use diversity. Diversity is a great tool to mitigate against sudden weather events. Imagine that you only had one crop in a field and you get a sudden weather event like a heat event or frost or a flood. You could lose your entire crop just through one single event. But in this area we have lots of different types of crops. We've got apples and pears and plums, cherries and rhubarb, artichokes. Each of those has a slightly different tolerance, and it's unlikely that they'll all be affected by severe weather events simultaneously in one year. So even if you lose one crop, you still have a very high yield in all the others, and that's a really important tool to use. The next thing we're going to talk about is cultivar choice and rootstock choice. This is Stirling Castle, which was a widely grown apple in the 19th century, coming from Scotland. It's fantastic against the cold, it's very good with adverse weather conditions, and it gave a very consistent yield, and it really only went out of favour when the heavy use of sprays came in and it didn't do very well with lime sulphur, so people stopped growing it. But it's a really good choice for areas where you do get extreme weather, and we are quite exposed here, and we grow a lot of different cultivars, particularly from northern England and Scotland, on this side of the orchard to mitigate against the cold weather. But we also choose more vigorous rootstocks. We use the M25 and the MM111 rootstocks on the apples because they're so good against the cold and also against drought, which can be a big problem. And that's very important when you're choosing which trees to grow. So the next thing we're going to talk about is pruning and how that protects against the weather, particularly the blossom in the spring, which is very vulnerable to sudden changes in temperature, heavy rain, hail on things like the plums, and obviously frost. If you look at this tree, this is pruned in an upward narrow cordon system, and you can see the individual flower buds are forming on this tree, and we're making sure that the vertical shape ensures that when you do get heavy rain or you do get strong wind, the fruit isn't pulled off or the blossom isn't hit with the frost or the cold, because the narrow shape is much less vulnerable to the extreme weather, and it makes a massive difference to the quality of fruit that you'll get. The final area we're going to look at is nutrition, and we're going to be talking about what you shouldn't add to the soil and the effects that can have on the trees, and then we're going to talk about what you should add. So what we don't add to our soil are fertilisers like nitrates and phosphates and sulphates and chlorides, and the reason that we don't add them is because they cause huge problems to the soil biology, which are so important for building robust trees which can cope with sudden changes in temperature or drought and disease pressure as well, all influenced by weather events. So anything that you add to the soil that affects the biology in a bad way is going to have leave the effect on the tree as making the tree much weaker and much more subject to climate change. The other problem with nitrogen fertilisers is if you do add that to the soil in the form of nitrate and ammonium, you promote very weak sappy growth with wide-spaced leaves and very subject to damage from frost. And that's because it's low carbon wood. It's so important to have a high carbon wood in your tree, and that's promoted by using calcium. So we're going to look next at what we add to the soil and how important they are, these additions. So what we do add here are liquid seaweed applications on the roots and on the foliage when the trees are young during the summer, and we use our basalt dust twice in the winter on the soil. And the effects of those two are very beneficial to create cold, hardy, disease-resistant plants. And that's such an important factor. So when we apply the rock dust in the winter, it's in the form of a silicate mainly. Rock dust has many hundreds of different minerals in there, naturally occurring, all the trace elements, no nitrogen, but particularly available forms of things like calcium silicates, which are then metabolized by the bacteria in the soil and go into the plant. And what you get from that during the growing season is this very high carbon wood. Particularly towards the end of the season, you can see the buds are close together, they're less than 2 inches apart, and that's a real sign that this is not nitrate growth, this is calcium growth, but most importantly, it's come in through the bacteria of the roots and gone up through the xylem straight into the stem. So that will give us a very hardy tree, and it will prevent it getting fire blight as well. And because we use the seaweed as a foliar spray, you form buds the previous year that have a very high cobalt and copper content, which makes them much more cold resistant, much more frost resistant, and much more likely to set fruit as well. That's the benefit of combining the basalt dust application with the seaweed applications. You get a synergy between them and a much tougher tree with a much higher yield. So hopefully this has been a useful video for you, and you can see that we're not completely helpless in the face of constant variability in the weather. And there are things you can do right at the start which will have a big effect on the overall success of your orchard, like choosing the right cultivars or choosing the right location. And then there are things you can do as you run your orchard which will have an effect on the yield day to day and year to year. For example, the nutrition that you use or the pruning. Come back to us soon. We've got a lot more videos to come, and consider subscribing.